To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
In this first conversation of many to come, Jim and I decide to dive deep using the next 10,000 years as our anchor. We look back at the long arc of emergence from the origin event all the way to our current technological age to figure out where we might be heading. Jim sees two main forks for our species. Either we're alone and we have a moral obligation to bring the universe to life, or we are part of a much larger galactic civilization and need to find our place in it. To navigate this, we talk about moving away from the short-term profit traps of Game A and toward membrionics, membranes defined by shared protocol and a cord that protects new ways of living from being disrupted by external pressures. And we also explore centering our lives around evolving worldviews, using multidimensional signaling for resources and intentionally designing for mutual dependence to keep us on track towards a thriving galactic future. I wish you lots of fun with this wide-ranging conversation.
There are perspectives, the Jim perspectives that you throw in that everybody already has. So let's try and not repeat those, but instead go into ones that you haven't said before, maybe even more edgy ones. And I want to pick the last of the 9 suggested topics that you brought up, which is the next 10,000 years as an anchor for the conversation.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, because it allows everything. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like the exercise of intentionally trying not to repeat myself because, I talk a lot, both on my own podcast and as guest on other podcasts. And sometimes I just get in automatic mode and just give the riff about this or that. I'll try not to do that and try to sort of, as Jordan Hall and I like to say, what did we call it? Real thinking, not simulated thinking.
Correct. Yes, I like that. Let's do some real thinking.
Let's do some real thinking.
The big question. We start this journey here now with into many hopefully conversations, and each conversations will have one topical focus. And today's topical focus is the next 10,000 years. Probably somewhat inspired by the previous 10,000 years, because there's a 10,000 year stable climate situation that's changed a lot of things for humanity. And right now we're making things unstable again. So the next 10,000 years is a good time frame and a valid time frame to think about.
Yeah, it's a good one because the current story should, move a long way in 10,000 years, and we very seldom think about that far out. That's not a natural human thing to do, and for good evolutionary reason. The most likely thing that's going to happen in the next 12 months is you're going to starve to death or get eaten by a lion, right? So avoid starving to death and avoid getting eaten by a lion, and everything else is third or fourth order after that. That's why it's so hard to think about climate change, for instance. It's something that each year only a little bit happens, but over 50 or 60 years is calamitous potentially, and we're just not evolved to think that way. So stretching it out to 10,000 is really interesting. Fortunately, I've been thinking a fair bit about exactly this question, more or less. So you want me just to take off?
Take off.
I haven't talked about
take off. It's the hardest thing to do, right? It's like I think Mark Fisher said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But it's even harder, and that's what that would be my addition, to think about a thriving world, and that's what I guess you're going for. So go ahead.
Okay. First, I'm just going to set some groundwork here. I've been doing a lot of work in the last 2 or 3 months on emergence, the idea that the higher levels of organization that have evolved over the history of the universe are real. That's my position. That you and I, as emergent artifacts, are as real as a rock. That the universe consists of both the dancers, let's say in the case of thinking of a human, the biochemical molecules that we make. I calculated I'd fit in a 55-gallon drum pretty well, barely. So imagine all those molecules. But those molecules in a 55-gallon drum are very unlikely to leap out of the drum and walk to the convenience store and buy a 6-pack of beer. But if I'm sitting in a lounge chair in that same front yard, I'm fairly likely to jump up, walk 2 blocks, and buy a 6-pack of beer and come back. And in the study of the science of emergence, we call that downward causality. Some high-level thing in this emergent consciousness of Jim Rutt suddenly decided it wants a 6-pack of beer, so it's dragged all these poor molecules down the street and back, even they're exceedingly unlikely to have done it on their own. And yet, the molecules obeyed the law of physics at all times. And so the upward line of causality maintains the Jim Rutt, and when it stops doing that, the Jim Rutt dies, right? The homeostatic circuits. But at the same time, things happening at these higher levels influence the trajectory of the lower level. And this seems paradoxical, and philosophy has struggled with this. There's, I'll eventually get to your question. So it's a paradox of how does both the upward causality and downward causality both be real without violating any laws of physics, but allowing for actual downward causation. And I've been doing some work on just that, and I think I have some results that, at least for limited cases, show how this could work and how it can be real. In the philosophical discussion of emergence, there's traditionally been the claim of weak emergence, which is that emergence is merely a description of what's going on. And then there's strong emergence, which is kind of spooky emergence. There's something new and special going on up here, but they don't specify what it is. And my position is neither, that there's more than weak emergence. There is something real about emergence, but there's nothing spooky about it, and it can be fully described through causal mechanisms, and yet there's still room for this upper level causal downward causality. So now, I'm going to back up a little bit for the running start for the next 10,000 years and talk a little bit about the last 13.6 billion years. Since the Big Bang, we start out with, I no longer use the Big Bang because I'm no longer sure there really was a Big Bang. I just call it the origin event, a time when the world was very small, very hot, and very different than it was afterwards. So the origin event happens. The world is probably a ball of energy and just energy, and it's probably smaller than the head of a pin, right? It may have been an actual singularity, but anyway, whenever the origin occurred, all kinds of stuff started happening very rapidly. This thing started growing, and the energy turned into matter, partially, using the E equals mc squared formula. But the matter was probably a swarm of quarks initially. The quarks, as the temperature came down, formed particles, protons, neutrons, electrons. Then the temperature lowered again, and those produced nuclei, where the neutrons and the protons were together. Each of those was an emergence, new things that were qualitatively different than what existed before emerged. And then about 300,000 years after the origin event, atoms with nuclei and electrons finally came together. And that changed fundamentally the nature of the universe. And at that point, photons could travel relatively uninhibited through space. Before that, there was so much clutter of bits and pieces of shit that electromagnetic radiation really couldn't penetrate the universe very far before it got scattered and deflected and absorbed and what have you. And so 300,000 years ago, so-called transparency event occurred, and from that point forward, information's flowing outward, etc., and the universe becomes fundamentally different. Then, during about the same period, clumping starts to accelerate. One of my core metaphysical holdings is the universe origin event had to either have some built-in non-homogeneity in it, or the fundamental nature of reality has to have some randomness in it. A lot of people think the universe is random due to quantum mechanics, but we don't know that to be true. Some of the quantum interpretations are fundamentally stochastic or random, but some of them aren't, right? At least 3 of the reasonable candidates for quantum interpretation are strictly deterministic. And there is no evidence to let us choose between these quantum interpretations. So I make this point all the time. We have to remain poised in openness about whether the universe is fundamentally deterministic or not. So if it is deterministic, because we saw this clumping, then the universe must have started with some clumping. If the universe is stochastic, then we can get clumping as a emergent result from the stochasticity. But in any case, we got clumps. The clumps formed galaxies. Subclumps formed stars. And then another huge emergence occurred due to the nature of our particular laws of physics, that when you got enough pressure, a star became big enough, it ignited fusion. And that's the energy source for our stars. And while we think about humans as being this amazingly cool thing here at the end of evolution, if you step back a ways and look at the universe as it is right now, by far the dominant thing is stars, right? The amount of energy coming out of one star for 1 second is probably more than all the energy that's been created and consumed and used by the human race since it's existed for 200,000 or 300,000 years. So the universe is principally a domain of stars. And for the story of emergence, which makes that important, is that emergence operates much more quickly in what are called conditions of disequilibrium. If you're out in intergalactic space where an occasional photon flies by, if emergence happens at all, it happens very slowly, and it probably does happen. Bigger molecules keep getting built. Or we know, for instance, that some fairly long molecules are built out in at least interstellar space. I don't know about intergalactic space. But when you're near a star, man, energy flux has gone crazy, and it is jiggling stuff around, and we're pretty damn sure that it's in conditions of disequilibrium that emergence really gets rolling. And so our stars are places where interesting things happen. Also, and this is important for the story of emergence, when the universe started, it was, even at the 300,000 year mark, when we first had atoms, it was exclusively hydrogen, mostly, helium, several percent, and a teeny smattering of lithium. And that's it. Now, fusion, especially for big stars, and many of the early stars were big, they burned very hot and very fast, and then they exploded, the supernova. And during those explosions, all the rest of the elements were created. Those were not in the universe in the beginning. And iron, silicon, copper, gold, platinum, they were all created during supernova. And the sun is thought to be at least a 3rd generation star. So there were 2 cycles before us, and probably more, and it's probably not as straightforward as saying 3rd or 4th generation, but it was a pattern of earlier stars contributed to the interstellar gas clouds that eventually came together to form our sun. And so that evolution and that emergence over time is critical to the rest of the story. For instance, human life requires a fair number of very specific, not human life, all the life of the sort we have on Earth requires a fairly extensive list of trace elements, one of which is molybdenum, right? Which is a pretty bizarre metal. And so it was fairly late in this cycle of stellar evolution and generations that enough molybdenum got concentrated in the interstellar medium to have the level of concentrations that we have here on Earth, which provided the substrate for life to occur. And then this huge open question, does life always occur when you have this combination of things, or is it an exceedingly rare event which mainly only happened once in the universe? Remember this, let's bookmark this particular thing. Did life happen once in the universe, very, very rarely, or does it happen all the time? And then life gets started, and there's a whole new chain of emergence that are speeded up by the information handling capability of life and metabolism and membranes and a whole bunch of inventions that happened very early in life. And we ran through, slowly at first, bacteria and archaea, and then we got what they're called eukaryotes, which are bigger single-celled creatures, not that long ago, maybe 1.1 billion years ago. And then we got a couple of different varieties of multicellularity, and then during the Cambrian explosion, 550 million years ago, plus or minus, we got our kind of multicellularity, which led to initially a whole bestiary of little creatures, insects, crabs, octopi, squid, worms of all sorts. An arms race happened very quickly in 5 million years. All the phyla that exist, of which there's like 23, which includes all animal life, those phyla were all created in 5 or 6 million years, which is unbelievable, with one exception that came later. And then the predator-prey arms race drove those phyla to get strong against each other. And that was an amazing driver in evolution. And probably just prior to that, the neuron evolved. And it turned out, of course, neurons were really handy if you're in a predator-prey arms race. And so these things got smarter and smarter, and then differentiated. We had fish, which are fairly smart compared to a sponge, right? And then we had somebody came out on land, so we had the early amphibians. Amphibians may be like a frog or a toad, conscious minimally, for instance, right? And then we go from amphibians to reptiles, and then reptiles branch mammals in one direction, birds in another. And the arms race is always going on. The lions chasing people learning how to use spears and keep the lions away, and fire and all this sort of stuff. And basically this chain of emergence keeps happening. And somewhere along the way in humans, language evolved, probably from symbols first, then language, then through the fact that we tend to use our language in systems of justification. I say, there's elk over that hill. And you say, well, why do you think that, right? Or are you just trying to get me to go over there so I can fuck your wife, right? And so that you ask me, well, how do you know there are elk over there? And then these systems of justification may well have been what bootstrapped our language. And so, we get to this point where the power of language and then the power of science and the power of technology allowed humans to, at first, free themselves from the constraints of their environment to a substantial degree, but at the same time to overwhelm our natural world. We can get back now, zoom in a little bit on the last few hundred years. The way I tell the story, at least, modernity started around 1700 with when these things came together. A subset of these things came together. First, real science, which was a new way to self-correct in real time in a dynamic, networked way, where you can rapidly bootstrap usable patterns about the universe. Democracy, you can think about it at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Scientific revolution was also 17th century. Newton was in the middle of the 17th century. And then modern finance with the establishment of the Bank of Amsterdam and the Bank of England Bank of England was 1694. I sometimes tick that one off as a key thing. And then very quickly, these things came together to produce the Industrial Revolution. But anyway, in 1700, the population of the Earth was 625 million. It's today 8 billion plus, probably headed for 10 or 11. And so here we are. We have, and oh, by the way, compared to the energy and material intensity of each human in 1700 was about a 12th what it is today, and that's if you include sub-Saharan Africans, Bangladesh, everything else. So you have about 12 times as many people, 12 times the intensity per person, so about 150 times the depredation on the ecosystem that we had when we started this game. And when we started this game, it seemed like a good game. Things got better quickly. In 1700, almost everybody lived in houses, if they had a house, with no windows and dirt floor. Half the kids died before they were 5. Starvation was always, one bad weather season away. And through leveraging these 3 attributes, we have built a world where there's a fair bit of resilience to the things we've been fighting all our 300,000 years as not very capable naked apes. But this game is accelerated, getting faster and faster and faster as the technological base increases. But it has no brakes. It has no way to stop itself. And so something's got to give. And we don't know quite what it is. We have some ideas. The thing we call Game B is one way to think about it. But let's now we've drawn the stage. Here we are in 2025. And what is our destiny? I intentionally drew this long arc of emergence and say, okay, that gets us up to here. What do we do with that from hereabouts? And this is where I haven't really talked about this too much, kind of personal, and what I think we should do as the human race. And that is that I think that these higher level emergences are what's interesting about the universe. And, in a simple way, you could say life is more interesting than non-life. Complex systems that are doing novel things under conditions of disequilibrium are more interesting than a pot of water at room temperature, which nothing happens. And so my vision of the next 10,000 years is the beginning of us moving out into the universe. And this is where it's kind of interesting and unfortunately not totally clear. I think there's 2 forks. One, remember back where I told you to bookmark, is life rare or not? If we're alone, and we might be, then we have a huge moral obligation, in my view of the world, to not screw this up, right? This is the chance the universe has to come alive. So in the next 10,000 years, if we're on the fork that we're alone, or think we're alone, or it's likely that we're alone, or you're even unsure if we're alone or not in this big, vast universe, we have to be very, very careful as we set the stage to bring the universe to life. 10,000 years, we should be able to send probes to stars and get data back. We should even be able, if we wanted to, and we're committed to it, to send out spores of very early, very robust life, like the kind of life that lives in hot springs or in the edges of volcanoes. And we could seed life where it isn't, and it might take root. The other fork, though, is very interesting, is maybe we're not alone. Maybe there's a very rich galactic civilization with thousands of technological species, probably many of them far superior to us, because keep in mind, we've only been a technological civilization with the ability to think clearly for 300 years, which is almost no time at all. And so there could well be societies out there that have been at that level for millions, hundreds of millions, or even 1 billion years. And God knows what they know and what they think and what they're doing. So fork 1, we're alone, or we're not sure that we're not alone, and we be very, very careful to preserve the opportunity to bring the universe to life. And our mission is to bring the universe to life and to allow increasingly cool, open-ended exploration of the possible for 1 trillion years. Let's be grandiose about it. But it starts around 10,000 years from now. On the other hand, we discover we're part of little green men exist and ladies, right? And we now then decide, how do we fit in with at least the galactic civilization? What part do we play in this much more grandiose tree of emergence? Because keep in mind, their tree of emergence also started with the origin event. So it's one tree, right? All the branches of interesting things that have happened in the history of the universe, anywhere in the universe, are all part of the same tree of emergence. And whether we are the ones whose job it is to just drive that tree to a whole new level, or whether we're one branch amongst many that have reached the level of technological civilization, is still a big open question. And I would say the job for the next 10,000 years is to, for now, assume that we're alone. Because if we are alone and we aren't careful, then we have done the universe a huge disservice in losing its trillion-year future of interestingness. And we should be preparing for the next 10,000 years to begin bringing the universe to life, while at the same time we should be making significant investments in trying to determine whether we are alone or not. So it's probably not the answer you were imagining, but that's what I consider as the boundary conditions for the next 10,000 years.
Love it. Now, you mentioned that a central driver for emergence is disequilibrium. And the probably best tool we have for either of these paths on these two forks, or any other really, over time spans like 10,000 years or more, is navigating or cultivating emergence in some direction, right? It's a higher order incentive system, if you will, right? For life itself. Now, the question is, how can you architect this equilibria in such a way that not only human population, but also whatever else is part of our world, the life on the planet, the chemistry on the planet, all of that tips into emergences that are more likely to fulfill one of those pathways that you just laid out or not. So it's a question of architecting, orchestrating disequilibria. How do you think about that?
My view on this is that at any instant in the history of the universe, there is the place that the universe is, right? And then there's the next move. Is it at a millionth of a second, or is it a second, or is it a day, a month, or a year? And the next move is into the adjacent possible. You can't leap from flint hammers to rockets to the moon all at once, right? There's a whole series of adjacent moves, minute by minute, day by day, month by month, as the system of complexity and emergence unfolds. In some cases it evolves, in other cases it unfolds, right? And the decisions that you make on each step, I think, are strongly related to whether we're heading in the right direction or not. And in the language of emergence, Harold Morowitz, who was one of my big influences on me, wrote a very cool book called The Emergence of Everything, where he lays out, I think it's 28 steps from the Big Bang to spirituality, and explains how each of those resulted from a new pruning rule, a rule on how we choose what next steps to take, or how the universe chooses it for us based on what has happened before. And like, for instance, a pruning rule of need matter to certain sets of matter to create life. Basically, that can't happen until all those elements are there. That's a pruning rule. You need molybdenum, God damn it. And so we're just waiting until molybdenum shows up to be able to create life like ours, at least. And if we talk about our current culture, and one of the reasons that it seems to some of us, at least, is moving in the wrong direction and not moving safely towards those two forks, is that almost the only pruning rule we have, at least in the cultural, economic, and technological realm, is it profitable in money on money return over the relatively short term, 3 years, let's say, 3 to 5 years. So
which then
we,
leads to the creation of disequilibria like war, for example, which
or the creation
right?
of just bad shit, right?
Yeah,
For instance, one of my current pet peeves is sports gambling, right? Today in the United States, sports gambling was illegal in everywhere except Las Vegas 20 years ago. Now you can pull up on your phone, be watching a baseball game, and bet on whether the next pitch is a ball or a strike. You're a 25-year-old drunk dude hanging out with his friends and get the dopamine hit of being right, being wrong, on just the right reinforcement schedule, a product that's designed by a team of 200 PhD psychologists who are in the rat torturing division of psychology, and it's going to drain your wallet, right? No sensible society would say we need sports gambling apps tuned by psychologists to drain the wallet of drunk 25-year-olds. But because it's profitable, a whole series of next moves in the adjacent possible space has resulted in, when you watch a baseball game, half the ads you see are for sports gambling apps. And the same, I would say, is true for things like TikTok. If you actually sat back and said, is TikTok good for the world? I would say no. I often say on my podcast, parents, giving your kids TikTok is probably at least as bad as giving your kids cigarettes. So please don't do it, right? But yet, because of the logic of money on money return, a whole series of smaller moves was made that drew our civilization in the direction of having TikTok, and then all the implications that came from that. So part of the steering job is getting much smarter, wiser is the word some people use, for the adjacent possible steps we make, so that we're at least more often moving in the direction of these two possible good futures for ourselves. And if we don't, we are being attracted to bad futures. I talked about the 150x depredation we're doing on the Earth relative to what we were doing in 1700. The people that study these things have established safe planetary limits for various kinds of depredation: soil loss, water extraction, species extinction, pollutions of various sorts, CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. And I think we're over those safe limits on 4 out of 9, and we're close on several others. So if we just keep expanding exponentially, driven by the pursuit of money on money return, we're going to be across those borders on all 9 of them. And at some point, technological life may become impossible, or at least a form of technological life that's still headed in a good direction may become impossible. And the lack of that kind of due consideration of our choices is of the essence.
Absolutely. Now, we've used the loss function of profit maximization, and that has turned into a future that we are living in right now, without anybody ever planning for that. Right? Nobody imagined
Nobody
a
asked
world
for the experiment. We're doing an experiment that nobody
exactly.
asked for.
And nobody asked for the outcome. Nobody envisioned this outcome. It just happened as an emergent property of the central loss function, generalized loss function of success measure of civilization at large. Now, if we flip this and take a 10,000-year outcome, like you just described, becoming a galactic species, either to fit in or to bring life into the universe, what would be useful loss functions on the level of the individual and on the collective that help us move there in Jim world? What would you say?
And I think that you mentioned the two together, and I think it's critical to look at the two together. The language I use is the institutional and personal spiral. Some of the things that we have been programmed by these many steps we've made of this unfolding of the adjacent possible are the status games that have been drilled into our heads. The first use of PhD rat torturers in business was back in the 1920s with the development of advertising, modern advertising techniques. A guy named Bernays, who was, I think, the son-in-law of Sigmund Freud, wrote a book called Propaganda on how to use psychological warfare to get people to buy stuff they didn't even think they needed, right? And that essentially accelerated this system. So we are now programmed by the world we grow up in to play a certain status game. The classic one in the United States, at least, is a shiny car and a big house and fancy vacations, and I can take Instagrammable pictures and all this stuff. And all these things are driving our per capita consumption of energy and material beyond any reasonable bound. If you tried to generalize a middle class American, Australian, or Canadian lifestyle to all 8 billion people on Earth, we're all done. We're all cooked. Can't happen, right? And yet, how can you morally say that the sub-Saharan Africans don't have as much moral right to shiny cars, big houses, and Instagrammable vacations as Americans do? I can't see any moral justification for saying it's okay for us, but it's not okay for them. So, that's the kind of conundrum we're in. So we have to change what we want at some level, right? But, I know lots of people, you included, who go off on these retreats and, talk to gurus and all this kind of happy horse shit. And they come back and they're improved for a bit, right? Maybe what they want and what they need is now a bit different than it was when they went off. But if you're thrown back into the cubicle farm processing health insurance claims all day and hanging out with your neighbors who are doing the equivalent, inevitably, except for the very strongest personalities, and most people are not strong personalities, you get sucked back into the norms of the game you're playing. And next thing you know, you're at the Porsche dealership or the Buick dealership, or, I'm no longer happy with my 200 square meter house. Now I need a 400 square meter house because I can afford it. And all those good intentions get sucked up by the institutions around us. So we need to change personally a bit at a time. Big jumps are dangerous, as we know. Marxist Leninism. We're going to make this communist man turn out to be a hellhole, right? And so be very careful about trying to move who we are as people too quickly. But we could move to say, a guy who goes to the Porsche dealer, buys a Porsche, probably suffering from a small dick, Make that a common view instead of, isn't he a cool dude? Isn't he likely to get laid, right? But we need social scaffolding, is the term I use, to stabilize the personal change, right? And so if you live in a community or in an ecosystem or in a little mini civilization where being skilled at singing is more valuable in terms of social status than driving a Porsche, then your probability of choosing to get better at singing than figuring out how to grub money till you can buy the Porsche is significantly increased. And then, by the way, the scaffolding allows you to stabilize the good change and allows you to make another change, right? Make another step up. And then the institutions you can build with the people are determined substantially by their capacities. If they have better capacities, we can build better institutions. And those institutions can scaffold more personal change and help bring it on. And if we do this correctly, we can get an upward spiral of personal institutional change. It's not clear how far it can go, but it could go a long way. Instead, we're stuck in a cycle of the reverse cycle, where our institutions are making us worse. Us worse people make worse institutions, which make us worse faster. You look at the decay of political culture in the West since 1960, and sure to hell seems like a downward institutional, personal spiral that is leading us to a very bad place, when in reality, we should be aiming to do the other, which is the upward personal institutional spiral. And until we can achieve that, our chances of moving the unfolding of the adjacent possible in the positive direction seems pretty speculative at best.
And where do we start? What's the most likely way to succeed to start this reversal of the cycle? towards a positive direction that can provide a scaffold and ratchet up slowly the systemic landscape that allows for the kind of emergence towards being galactic.
Well, the best I've been able to come up with, and this is working with lots of other smart people, is that we should learn from the origin of life. The origin of life started out as a zoo of chemistry, probably near a hot spot in the bottom of the ocean, or possibly a pond on the land, with high gradients of energy and lots of weird chemicals. But it kept getting disrupted by ocean currents and things of that sort, and couldn't reach the concentrations to trigger these cycles of metabolism until somewhere along the line, the material that would self-assemble as a membrane occurred. We believe it was a fatty acid, which in the presence of water, because of some very low-level chemical forces, tends to produce bubbles with membranes. And probably some lucky membrane happened to be formed that had just the right set of chemistry in it, and just enough heat, just enough light to provide the far from equilibrium effect, and voila, metabolism ignited. And it also probably needed information handling so that it could reproduce and continue to doing this thing. And so we think that a plausible route is to consciously produce membranes that allow people to create institutions and personal chains that are stabilized, but are not disrupted by externalities, by external currents. In fact, one of the parts of our analysis is that you'll know you're in a good membrane when doing the right thing is being promoted by the local environment, not resisted. When in the world today, a lot of times you try to do the right thing as a business person, you're going to lose, right? The currents are against you. The currents provide you every incentive to do the wrong thing. When you're in a membrane that's headed in the right direction, the currents are encouraging you and helping you to do the right thing, rather than being a force in your face as you try to do what's right in moving towards our goal. So that's, I think, the best I have so far is creating relatively small membranes that can resist the temptations and the forces to do the wrong thing, and provide us a context in which to at least get this personal institutional spiral going.
So membrane, in a way, is the central tool for emergence management, because it's the way to control equilibrium, right, between the two sides of the membrane, which is how life emerges. And on a collective level, like you described it, I can see it. How would you start on with the individual? So is it possible? And I'm just going to try to phrase it neutrally. Is it possible, or was it possible so far in your life, to create membranes within yourself that allowed for the emergence of Jim as you are here today? Was there something that a former version of you did to establish some pathways inside of your being that helped you emerge the Jim that you wanted to be? Or was it pure serendipity?
I'm sure there's a difference between the two, right? It could be membranes, but it could have been serendipitous. In my own case, I was always a little bit of a different dude who didn't really care what other people thought, what have you. But I did enjoy playing the game and playing it hard and rough if necessary, as I sometimes say on my podcast. I was definitely a game A motherfucker back in the day, right? I started companies, I worked for companies, I was, very successful most of the time. Sometimes my shit blew up, but oh well, right? I was really good at it. And I just enjoyed doing it, and it was sufficiently absorbing that I didn't have a whole lot of time to think about other things, though I did continue to read, fortunately. I always read 75 to 100 books a year since I was 10 years old. And at the time, I was most embedded in the belly of the beast. as a senior C-level executive at a global 200 company. It doesn't get much more belly of the beast than that. I started getting exposed to the idea of sustainability and the fact that the Earth is a closed system. Around the same time, I started getting exposed to cognitive science and psychology and how people can be programmed by the ecosystem around them. And around 1994, I had a combined epiphany that being a game A motherfucker is probably not the highest use of a person who has some level of talent in some things. And I continued to be a game A motherfucker for another 6 years, but my heart really wasn't in it. And after a few more cycles, I started learning and studying, particularly in complexity science towards the end of this. And then in 2000, I had an opportunity to sell my last company, and I had lots of opportunities to go do it again. I've been very successful with that last company, but I just told everybody, no, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm done. No more game A motherfucker, no more business. And instead I went and studied complexity science. And then that led to thinking about how to do all these things and come up with the idea of embryonics and personal institutions. All this shit emerged from the thinking about how do we apply a complexity lens to the problems we have to steer society away from the cliff of unsustainability, away from the bad pruning rule of the emergence of the next round of the adjacent possible to something other than that, which is maximizes short to medium term money on money return. And that became my personal lodestar. And it was partially serendipitous. I ran into an online community of sustainability thinkers, which had a big influence on me. I read some of the right books at the right time. I got exposed to the complexity lens for reasons that weren't too involved with the sustainability stuff. Actually, I started learning about it to be a more skillful game A motherfucker, right? And I even came up with a theory for our big company of how to do mergers and acquisitions using a complexity lens, which actually made our big company bigger and more voracious. So the fact that I stumbled into complexity for a self-serving reason, combined with a sustainability view, caused some reaction to occur, which produced whatever that new membrane was that took me in a different direction.
In the language of Joscha Bach, there's this loop between the two sides of the membrane, if you basically in that you can make tighter and tighter, and he says over which you wake up. If you get this loop that's tighter and tighter, you wake up over that loop. And it's what I'm hearing in a way is that there was a series of serendipitous events that led to the emergence of some insights that then in turn became new membranes that created a tighter loop continuously. Would you say there's a pattern or something that you would recommend people to, or what should systems be designed like that help people get into that tightening of the loop towards becoming, I want to avoid the higher level consciousness term, but to become more in charge of the design of the membrane within themselves and around themselves and around their collective? What are the pathways that help people into that?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak for everybody. I can talk a little bit about my own.
No, let's talk about Jim. What does Jim think?
Yeah,
that's why we're here.
I think I was fortunate in that. Again, serendipity or or navigation. Which is it, right? Probably a bad idea, but I read the Foundation trilogy when I was 10 years old, right? And the idea of psychohistory turns out to be entirely wrong and completely contrary to complexity thinking, where you can, we can predict the future for 20,000 years. No, you can't, sorry. But it did provide me with a taste for worldviews. And so I think if you're going to create a membrane that can make a difference, at least for me, I'm not going to say it's needful for everybody, but cultivating your personal worldview is important so that you have a coherent way of putting together what it is you learn in your journey through life. And then at the same time, and this was probably a combination of genetics and my birth family, I've always been very open to experience. I like to quote Voltaire, who said, "Once for experience, more is perversion." Right? But I'll try once, almost anything, right? And non-judgmentally initially. And then I'll incorporate it into my worldview, or I'll reject it, or I'll be open and say, not sure. I have to keep thinking about this one and looking there. So a combination of a commitment to a personal worldview and being open to experience, and therefore open to updating your worldview based on what you saw and learned. So back to my own story, here I am, a pretty accomplished, high-speed, game A motherfucker. I get exposed to complexity thinking and sustainability thinking more or less simultaneously. Both of those I'm open to add to my worldview, and voila, there's a pretty major reaction and changes my worldview. And since I am, navigating by my worldview above all else, my behavior starts to change very radically over time. And I suppose that's the other one. So you have a worldview, you're open to experience, you're open to updating your worldview. Hugely important. If you can't update your own worldview, you can't make this transaction. But then also always having been relatively committed to honoring my worldview, whatever it happened to be, even if it was bad, right? So I had a theory for why I did what I did at any given time. And so hence, if I get my worldview to be a good one, then I start doing good things. And this is where community is hugely important, right? We have a lot of, our worldviews drift. If we get our worldview from watching Fox News, it drifts one way. If we get it from, hanging out on TikTok, it drifts another way. If we hang out in a community of people who are resonating towards some shared sense of the good, then our worldviews probably start to converge, and this shared sense of the good that's greater than any of us and bigger than any of us could hold in our head starts to impinge into our worldviews, and our worldviews start getting more and more similar, and our coherence increases, and we can actually do things together with a more shared worldview. Not going to be identical. We wouldn't want them to be identical, but have some elements in common. Like, for instance, if you have a worldview that you live in a sustainable world, where you're looking for sustainability in a finite world where the consumption of resources is growing exponentially, if you have those things in your worldview and you take it seriously, then there's a whole class of things you should not do, right? And so I think that is kind of the essence of my own personal journey, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So being clear and conscious about what your worldview is and how it fits into the reality and how your set of values and actions emerges out of it and how it can be changed, and being conscious about that it is being changed and where that change is coming from. So putting worldview at the center. I think that's very interesting. That would change the education landscape dramatically if you built an education system around worldview at the center, to empowering young humans to define, design, redesign, recalibrate, continuously evolve their worldview in a way that is non-dogmatic, non-ideological from an outside perspective. So they're free to choose what they want to incorporate into their worldview and have to be conscious of why. I think that could be a valid first component in the design of that civilization that manages to go galactic.
Yeah, that could certainly be a part. I hadn't really thought about this before, so we're sort of doing real thinking here, right? That that we alluded to the fact that if people are committed to worldviews and they're in community, there's the opportunity for convergence into worldviews that operate in community to be able to produce greater things than any one person can do. We know humans are fundamentally a social animal. You drop a naked human anywhere on Earth pretty much and they're going to be dead in a couple of weeks. But a civilization can exist in the Arctic Circle or in Death Valley or anywhere else, because the ability of a collection of humans is vastly greater than any one human. And synchronizing around worldview, this is interesting. Okay, and you want them to be similar enough that you have coherence, but you want them to be different enough that you have parallax, that you can have multiple points of view. The real diversity, not the nose counting diversity, but diversity in how people think about a problem and how they approach the world and what they value even, but not too different. So you want diversity and coherence in intention and in balance, and particularly around worldviews.
And okay, so I'm just trying to put this into a picture in my mind in the context of trying to have 8 billion people start coordinating in a different way that will lead to a intergalactic or galactic civilization. And so I'm seeing groups of people who are equipped with the means to really establish what their worldview is, how they see reality, how they interpret what's happening to them, how they extract their agency from that, and they're in communion with each other around some shared portion of the world, right? So that it needs to be something like a shared worldview, shared enough so that they can be in coherence around it and start doing things. If I see that, and that already is quite a challenge and wouldn't work without the membrane around that community that you described, that makes it possible inside of whatever else, whatever environment it is in, like the current game A shit show Morlockian situation. But now let's imagine this starts working. So people find a way to live a thriving, successful life in a community of that sort. They manage to cohere around worldview. They might go from one community to the next if their worldview shifts too far off the view of the community. They even find ways to disrupt their worldview from time to time so that it doesn't become too homogeneous, right? There needs to be heterogeneity inside of that community in order, like you said, diversity, so that innovation can even happen and problem solving can happen.
Yep, and I think that's important. And
yeah,
okay,
go ahead. No, go ahead. Good.
I was going to say that at least some of the thinking about these membranes is, and some of this comes from John Vervaeke, had a big influence on me, and his idea, which he calls the religion that's not a religion, and that we need these strong sauce experiences, these shakings of the box. Is it taking psychedelics? Is it ecstatic dance? Is it wild sex? Is it staying up for 3 nights and staring at a fire for 3 nights, right? These things will take your brains to weird-ass places. And doing those things in your life, I believe, are important to give you an opportunity to move, to allow your worldview to morph. And on the other hand, if you do them every day, you just become a disordered person, probably, who becomes addicted to the experience. That's why it's easy to get addicted to drugs. That's why it's easy to get addicted to sex, right? you need to use them as strong spices in the cooking of the stew that is your life, but you don't want any one of them to overwhelm it. And it also speaks to the mix of people you want in your membrane. There are people who are better at these kinds of things. We sometimes call them shamans, right? Who can help guide people to these extreme perspectives and guide them back and help guide them to not becoming addicted to them, but to use them as the spice in the stew and not the stew itself. And so when you're thinking about who you want to bring into your membrane, I'm thinking probably you want to make sure you have, 1%, 2% shamanic type people. They may not be very good at doing the everyday work, but they may be indispensable to the long-term health of the entity by helping people shake the box, but not shake the box too much. And getting that right is going to be hard.
Also as being the membrane to other groups on the outside, because they're more open than others to new experiences, so they can interface better with other groups of people. And that brings in the next and really, really difficult and important big question, which is, historically, we've been able to organize what we just talked about to, let's say, up to about 4,000 people. Now we're 4 billion. How can we build a system based in this, deeply based in this, I know you use coherent pluralism. I use coherent pluralism as a term a lot as well, on a very, very local scale, and bring that up all the way to a coherent 8 billion people working towards becoming galactic. What is needed for those 8 billion people to do that?
That's a good question. I don't think anybody actually knows. I think what we can do is think of approaches that might allow us to navigate towards that. I will say that try to learn from what hasn't worked in the past. I find that to be very useful in my entrepreneurial career, or what are all the goddamn mistakes you made? Don't make the same mistake twice. And I think one lesson that the 20th century in particular taught us, which is to be very suspicious of top-down, right? Fascism, Marxist-Leninism, crackpot religious theocracies like Iran, right? This does generally not come up with a good solution, but at the same time, bottom up without some top down can become incoherent and very difficult to navigate as a whole. So the best thinking that people I'm in communion with have come up with is to have a very small set of accords, agreements, that we all agree that in the bigger membrane of all of humanity, there's a handful of things that we agree to. And those things could be as simple as the purpose of the membrane is to live a life of high quality human well-being while remaining in balance with the natural world to honor its ability to generate emergence, while we steer towards bringing the universe to life or joining the intergalactic or the galactic civilization. But below that, we start at the bottom, especially when we're embedded in the status quo in game A. Building big things initially is going to be really, really hard, but building small things probably not that hard. It doesn't cost that much money. You don't have to convince that many people. Let's say $20 million and 150 people. You may be able to build a membrane that has very strong sauce, that has its own local accords, which are not in conflict, in fact, are supportive of the very few top-level accords. But it could be very different. That these lowest level or low-level entities can be quite diverse. They could be religious, they could be atheistic, they could be very Victorian in their sexual mores, they could be polyamorous, they could be something in between. Doesn't really matter, as long as they have strong sauce, which is providing high level of well-being to their people while operating in a way that is coherent with the other two aspects, the preserving the natural world's diversity, and maybe even improving it, and keeping us at least loosely on track towards the stars. And then I see the membrane self-organizing. So just give an example. Let's suppose we have 10 of these Dunbar number, 150 people level villages that, and 6 of them have as their economic base organic farming. And they sell their stuff to the local people outside the membrane. Because one of the key things about the membrane, the analysis says that membranes have to work. You know, if a cell can't bring in what it needs from the outside enough to live, and it can't excrete its toxins, it'll die, right? And in fact, in reality, if a life form is going to prosper, it needs to be able to take in enough stuff not only to operate its metabolism, but also to grow and then divide, and hence be part of an exponential growth. And so each of these membranes has to work, quote unquote, but then they can also bring into being higher level membranes to help them work. So let's say of these 10 villages, 6 of them are doing organic farming, but they've found that the problem of marketing their produce is kind of hard for them to do individually. And they find themselves getting gouged by the local agricultural supply stores when it comes to buying their seeds and tractors and things of that sort. So they say, well, we got 6 of us here. Let's form a membrane that includes all 6 of us, but only includes all 6 of our communities in a limited domain. So the accords, the agreements for this new level membrane, we'll call it the Organic Agricultural Cooperative. And it has a marketing arm, it has a warehouse, it negotiates in bulk to buy seed and tomato stakes and tractors at attractive prices. But its remit is only about organic agriculture and does not otherwise impinge on what's going on in the lower level membranes. And then you could imagine other membranes that intersect these membranes. So it's not a hierarchy of membranes, it's a crazy network of membranes. So let's say one of the villages specializes in heirloom tomatoes. That membrane may be a member of the Guild of Heirloom Tomato Growers across a wide region. And they have in-person and virtual ways of exchanging information, trading seeds with each other, doing breeding experiments. And so they have coherence around their guild, around the work that they do. And so you could be a member of many things. I'm a member of the village. I'm a member of the Heirloom Tomato Guild. My village is a member of this cooperative. This cooperative is a member of a regional group. And these things are arranged in such a ways that as much independence is maintained at the lower levels as is feasible with the membrane that you have chosen to join. And let me give you a sharp way of thinking about how those accords could evolve in different kinds of ways. So let's take the organic marketing membrane, the co-op, and it could say that we are an organic agriculture co-op, which means one of 2 things. The first is that we are only going to market organic produce from our member villages. But we don't care if they also do some not organic farming. Alternatively, it could be a stronger form of accord at this intermediate level where it says we only allow members who commit to doing organic only agriculture. And either of those forms of accord is allowed. So they can be accords that only apply to the higher level membrane, or they could be heritable accords, which are mandatory for the members of that membrane. And it's up to the designers of that intermediate membrane to decide whether it wants mandatory heritable agreements or whether it wants at this level only agreements. And if you think about these membranes within membranes within membranes that have differing accords, some of which are mandatory heritable and some of which are not, you get a very interesting, highly diverse set of entities at every scale, from the family on up to, presumably the whole globe that has self-organized itself around relatively local decisions, and yet within the context of this few small number of high-level accords. And something like that is the best story I can come up with on how it's possible to start small with strong sauce to produce lives that people really want, and yet over time build a structure that could actually tip the whole system into the right direction. It might take 50 or 100 years, but it's the best story I got.
Mm-hmm. So how I'm hearing this is you're envisioning interwoven markets based on those membranes, because the signaling between the actors in the markets are controlled by their membranes, right? It's different kinds of signals, different kinds of accepting of signals. You could also say everybody comes up with 10 different kinds of currencies that are new modalities of signaling. Now, how in the current form, we are using mostly fiat money, which has a growth obligation built in to do market signaling as the only or most prominent modality of market signaling. And it has some, next to the exponential growth obligation, it also has methods of accumulation built into its design, which skews the markets, which then makes the markets fail, which is what we're observing. So how do you counter the misdesign of signaling within such markets? What mechanisms come to mind that could help us with that?
Very good question, because a significant amount of our misapplication of the adjacent possible is that we're responding to this one signal. Is it profitable? And we suspect that the right answer is higher dimensional. You mentioned that. And I'll give you an example, which I've used before, which is, let's imagine a bioregion along the coast of the east coast of the United States. And one of the resources in the coastal waters are bluefish, which are a relatively abundant fish, which you can harvest at pretty high rates. They reproduce quickly. But if you take too many of them, the population crashes, as is well known and has happened before. So the bioregion agrees, and all the communities in the bioregion agree. How they agree, that's going to be tricky, but let's imagine that they do. That we, the bluefish management membrane, will appoint good natural biologists to study our bluefish population and estimate what is the safe amount we can harvest each year, and without negatively impacting the population and without causing other cascades down the food chain. And let's say they come up with 8 million pounds of bluefish can be safely harvested each year. So the bluefish membrane generates 8 million tokens, each good for 1 pound of bluefish, distributes them per capita to the member of the bluefish membrane. And if you want to buy a pound of bluefish, you have to pay whatever the person wants in fiat currency or Bitcoin or gold or whatever else. But you also have to provide 1 pound of bluefish, tokens worth 1 pound of bluefish. You have two signals going on simultaneously. And the second signal makes sure that no more than 7 million pounds of bluefish get transacted each year. And if you're only contract for 7 million, there's no reason anybody wants to supply more than that. So it provides top to bottom signaling to coordinate that we don't overfish our bluefish. Then to get a little bit more elaborate, bluefish is a non-universal taste. It's a strong, oily fish. Some people really like it. I like it. It's kind of like herring. Some people love herring. Some people hate herring. So probably 3/4 of people don't like bluefish. So what the hell do? They basically tell their automated trading agent, I don't like bluefish. Work with other trading agents to swap my bluefish tokens for things I do want, right? Oh, I like cod. Oh, and I like, I need some oak to build a barn this year. So, but use your artificial intelligence working with other agents so that we do the best we can in swapping the things that we personally aren't interested in for things that other people aren't interested in. And so I accumulate some oak tokens, I accumulate some cod tokens, etc. And all those tokens together, because they were set by people for principled reasons, when they interoperate with the more fungible currencies, produce the closure around protecting the resource.
That makes a lot of sense. That might even work.
It might.
And I'm while you were describing this, I was thinking around the question. In some edge cases, we still might to have to enforce some behavior. Maybe not all behavior can be captured by market-driven mechanisms like this with different signaling modalities, and they need to be somehow bound in a different way. How do you think about enforcement mechanisms that in the context of what you were just describing? So let's say there's some resource that is not yet managed with a resource-based secondary token, and it's being exploited, and that's being noticed. How's that handled?
That's one of the hardest problems in this system. I can't tell you I've got a solid answer for it, but we have identified that it's a problem. Let me give you a slightly simpler case. Let's say there is a river valley that is a bioregion, and many villages and bigger collectives exist in it. And one town insists on running a horrific chemical factory, and they dump the waste right into the river untreated. And everybody downstream is getting poisoned by this chemical effluent from the chemical factory. But the people, for whatever reason, say, hey, we make a lot of money selling this chemical. Nobody else is willing to deal with this nasty carcinogenic shit, but we are. And tough luck, fuck you, right? That's just unacceptable. And it may be that these people are unwilling to come into a cooperative arrangement with the other people in the bioregion, so something has to happen. Now, I want to have the least compulsion and coercion in this system as possible. As much should be by voluntary choice in our relationships as possible. But in some cases, coercion will be necessary. In this case, I would say it is. And I would hope first that we would try the Mennonite trick of shunning, which is, all right, if you insist on producing this nasty carcinogenic chemical, nobody else in the bioregion will do any business with you. We won't talk to you. We won't let your kids come into our schools. You can't drive on our roads. So we will punish you by exclusion. And that's a very strong sanction. And in many cases, that may be enough. People say, I don't want to be shunned by all my neighbors for 50 miles in every direction. Life kind of sucks when I'm being shunned. And one would hope most cases could be handled by that kind of collective action of shunning without having to use specific coercion. But there may come a time where these people are really crazy. Let's say they have a religious belief that producing this carcinogenic chemical is their duty to the god of their particular village. And they don't give a shit about the fact they're becoming poorer and their kids have no friends. They keep making it. Well, it may be that the bioregion says, sorry guys, we've got to organize a militia and go kick their ass. Sorry. I would hope that would be an extreme rare event, and that other methods of first trying to reach mutual agreement, then use shunning or exclusion as a tool, and only an absolute last resort would you develop, aggressive, coercive collective action. But you can't take it off the table, because there may be times when you have to do it.
Well, all of that works. The shunning is really powerful as long as your thriving life depends on the immediate surroundings. But as soon as the market for your horrible products that is poisoning the river is somewhere else, and the schools of your children are somewhere else, and maybe you're having robots running the factory, so you don't even have to be there, then that becomes really, really difficult, right? And how do we bind that? Is there a way to say that we limit the reach of markets? So is it do you want to enforce something to be local? Can it also be solved by market mechanisms like a token, like a locality token that loses value the further it is away from home? What comes to mind for you?
Well, an idea, new idea, real thinking. Maybe we want to think about modalities that build in enough mutual dependence. Because if your town is getting your food from me, and I say, if you don't stop those chemicals, I'm not going to give you any food. We have built a relationship that provides reason for us to reach some kind of agreement. I want to be able to sell my food, right? A customer is a good thing to have, and you want the food, so we better come to some agreement because we have a mutual dependency. And so as we think about these membrionics, maybe a design principle is such that we intentionally encourage the development of mutual dependency. I'm not quite sure what that means. It's the first time I've had that thought. But that might be a way to allow collective action to have more traction.
Well, Tyson taught me that collectives of tribes work like that, right? That there are, like you described them as guilds, but they could also be clans or families that are responsible for one thing, like water. And they didn't first because somebody is really talented at dealing with water, but over time this turns into a clan or a guild that cares for the water. But of course they're dependent on the others that do school and food and housing and all of that. So this interdependence is a vital element in the thinking of indigenous people, at least in Australia. How to build it into a global system is a next level challenge.
That's an interesting question. Do we just have a moral sense that it's wrong to become too autarkic? Advanced technology may allow us to become more autarkic. If we have robots and 3D printers, and we have our own solar energy. I don't need anybody else's energy. I'm self-sufficient. Actually, what seems good in some ways could also actually be something that reduces the forces towards coherence, and that's worth thinking about. How do you demand mutual dependence without being coercive? I don't know. It's an interesting design problem, but at least if we identify the fact that some level of mutual dependence is actually a good, it can provide us a goal for our thinking to think about how we can encourage something to at least approximate an optimal amount of mutual dependence.
I like that idea of establishing mutual dependence as a function of the system, and maybe we can take that as the starting point for our next little journey, and remember that and see what unfolds from there, and bring today's 90 minutes already to a close, but make sure that we have a next conversation on that topic very soon. How does that feel?
Yeah, that's gonna have to think about that one a little bit. I've never had that thought before. So it'll be a fun exploration, and we'll both think about it for a day or two, or whenever we have our next conversation, and we can start there and see where it goes.
Cool, that we do.
All right, should we wrap it there?
Let's wrap it here for today, and then.